I was standing in the middle of my son's kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in October, and nobody was talking to me. That sounds like a small thing, I know it does. And if I had heard someone else say it, I probably would have thought, well, that's just how family gatherings go. People are busy, people are moving around, there's food to put out and kids to chase, and conversations happening in every corner of the room. But I had been standing in that kitchen for about 12 minutes, I know, because I had checked my watch twice. And in those 12 minutes, my son Kevin had walked past me 3 times without stopping. My daughter-in-law Renee had reached around me to get something from a cabinet above the stove and said, "Excuse me the way you say it to a stranger." And my 2 grandkids had run through the kitchen twice at full speed without so much as a glance in my direction. I was 68 years old, and I was standing in the middle of my son's kitchen holding a glass of sweet tea that was getting warm in my hand, and I was, for all practical purposes, invisible. Not ignored. I want to be careful about that word because it implies intention, and nobody in that kitchen was intentionally ignoring me. That was almost the harder part of it. They weren't looking past me because they were angry with me or indifferent to me. They were looking past me because I had simply stopped being the kind of presence that required their attention. For most of my adult life, I had been the kind of man who walked into a room and things organized themselves around him. Not out of ego, just out of function, just out of the fact that I was the one who knew what needed doing and who made sure it got done. I was the one people looked to. I was the one they called. And standing there in Kevin's kitchen with my warm sweet tea and my 12 uninterrupted minutes of invisibility, I understood something I'd been circling around for months without quite landing on it. I was no longer that man, and I had no idea who I was instead. I spent 38 years working in municipal government, specifically in public works administration for a mid-sized city in the Midwest, and I understand that when most people hear that they picture a man pushing paper in a gray office somewhere, and there was certainly some of that, more than some of it, honestly. But the reality of what I did was more substantial than the title ever suggested. I started at 24 as a field coordinator, which meant I was out on job sites more than I was in any office, managing road crews and drainage projects and utility maintenance schedules, wearing a hard hat and steel-toed boots, and learning the actual physical infrastructure of a city from the ground up, literally from the ground up, from the pipes under the streets and the culverts under the highways, and the bridge supports that most people drive over every single day without a thought for what holds them up. I worked my way through several positions over the years, each one carrying more responsibility than the last. And by my mid-40s, I was the Deputy Director of Public Works, overseeing a department of about 230 employees and an annual budget that ran into the tens of millions. That's not a brag. I'm telling you the scale of it because I want you to understand what it meant to my daily life, what it meant to my sense of who I was, because the scale of what you manage becomes part of you, whether you intend it to or not. Every morning when I drove into that building, I was responsible for something real. The roads people drove on, the water that came out of their taps, the systems that kept the city functioning in ways its residents never had to think about, which was, in a strange way, the measure of success. If I did my job well, nobody noticed. The water ran clean, the roads held up, the stormwater drained the way it was supposed to after a heavy rain. And life went on uninterrupted for 300,000 people who had no idea my department existed. There is a particular kind of satisfaction in that kind of invisible competence, in being the person who keeps things running smoothly enough that the running goes unnoticed, and I lived inside that satisfaction for nearly 4 decades without fully appreciating what it was giving me. My alarm went off at 5 o'clock every weekday morning, and I was out of the house by 5:50, usually with a travel mug of coffee and whatever I had packed the night before for lunch, because the cafeteria in our building made a decent enough hot plate. But I was a creature of habit, and I liked knowing what I was eating at noon without having to make a decision about it at noon. The drive-in was about 22 minutes on a good day, longer in winter when the roads were bad, and I used that drive to mentally organize the day ahead, running through the meeting schedule, thinking about the project updates I needed, anticipating the problems that might surface before 9 o'clock. Because in public works, there were always problems before 9 o'clock. A water main issue somewhere, a crew short-staffed because of illness, a piece of equipment down at the worst possible time. I was good at anticipating problems. I was good at staying calm when they arrived and finding the quickest workable path through them, and that ability, That steadiness under the daily pressure of keeping a city's infrastructure from falling apart was something I was genuinely proud of in a quiet way, that I never talked about much but that I carried with me every day. Like a tool I knew how to use. The people I worked with, the engineers and project managers and crew supervisors and administrative staff, they were, for most of my career, more familiar to me than almost anyone outside my immediate family. I knew their kids' names and their health problems and which ones were going through divorces and which ones were saving up for something and which ones needed extra patience on Monday mornings and which ones you could count on absolutely when something went sideways at 3 in the afternoon on a Friday. You build a kind of knowledge of people over decades of working alongside them that is different from friendship and different from family, but is its own real thing, its own form of intimacy, and I had that with a lot of people in that building for a very long time. My wife, Patricia. We've been married 41 years. She used to say that I knew my staff better than I knew my own children, and she said it with the particular tone that meant she wasn't entirely joking. I don't think she was wrong. I was present at home. I want to be clear about that. I showed up. I was there for the important things, and most of the unimportant ones too. But there was always a part of me that was still at work even when I was home, still running the next day's agenda in the background of whatever was happening at the dinner table, still half listening to my kids' stories, while the other half of my brain was composing an email I needed to send first thing in the morning. Kevin used to call it the 1,000-yard stare. Dad's sitting right there, but he's somewhere else, and he said it like it was just one of Dad's things, which I think was his way of accepting something he couldn't change. I accepted a lot of things I probably should have examined more closely during those years. But the work was always there, always pressing, always asking for the part of me that I gave most readily because I was best at it, and it's very hard to pull back from something you are genuinely good at, especially when people are depending on you to keep being good at it. I retired on a Friday in June, 3 years ago now, after 38 years with the city, and the planning that went into that retirement was about as thorough as anything I had ever managed professionally, which is saying something because I was not a man who left details unattended. Patricia and I had been having what I called the retirement conversations for at least 5 years before it actually happened, sitting at the kitchen table on Sunday mornings with the finances spread out in front of us, running the numbers, looking at the pension, looking at the Social Security projections, looking at the Social Security projections, looking at the savings and the investments and the house which was paid off and the healthcare costs which were not going to be small. I am the kind of man who needs to know that the plan is solid before he can commit to it. And by the time I actually handed in my retirement paperwork, I had run those numbers so many times I could recite them in my sleep. The financial side of it I felt genuinely good about. It was the other side, the what do I do with myself side, that I thought about less carefully and that I now wish I had thought about a great deal more. I had a list, the way most men approaching retirement have a list. All the things I had been putting off for decades because there was never enough time, never enough energy at the end of a long week. Never enough unscheduled space in the calendar to really dig into anything that didn't have a deadline attached to it. The list was real, and it was long. I wanted to finally restore the 1967 Ford Mustang Fastback that had been sitting under a tarp in our garage for 11 years, a project I had started and abandoned twice already because work always pulled me back before I could get any real momentum going. I wanted to do some traveling. Patricia and I had talked for years about driving the Pacific Coast Highway from top to bottom, taking our time, stopping wherever looked interesting, staying in small motels and eating in local diners and not being on any schedule that mattered. I wanted to spend more time with Kevin and his family, more time with my grandkids who were 6 and 9 and growing at a pace that made me quietly anxious every time I saw them, aware that the window of them wanting to spend time with their grandfather was not infinite, and that I had been letting it narrow by being too busy and too far away for too long. I wanted to read more. I had a stack of books on my nightstand that had been there so long some of them had faded on their spines. I wanted to sleep past 5 o'clock without feeling guilty about it. I had all of this waiting for me, this whole constructed vision of what life after work was going to look like, and I believed in it, the way you believe in a plan you have thought through carefully, with the confidence of a man who had spent 4 decades making plans work through sheer preparation and persistence. I had also watched other men retire ahead of me, and I had paid attention to what seemed to work for them. My colleague Robert, who had been the city's chief engineer for 20 years before he retired, he had taken up serious woodworking, and within 18 months, He was selling custom furniture at craft fairs and seemed genuinely happier than I had ever seen him at work. My neighbor across the street, a man named Gerald who had retired from a banking career, he and his wife had joined a travel club and spent their first 2 years of retirement going somewhere new every 6 weeks. And whenever I saw him in the driveway, he had a tan and an easy smile and the general appearance of a man who had made the right call. I used these men as evidence that retirement could be what I imagined it would be, that the transition was manageable, that the rewards were real. My last day at the office was everything a last day is supposed to be. There was a gathering in the large conference room on the second floor, the one with the windows that look out over the municipal plaza and the fountain that my department had repaired twice in the last decade. There was a cake, sheet cake from the bakery 2 blocks over that the administrative staff always ordered for retirements, white cake with white frosting, and my name written in blue icing. There were speeches from people I had worked with for a long time, genuinely warm speeches that made me feel seen in a way that I stored carefully inside me because some part of me knew, without saying it, that this particular kind of being seen was ending. My director, a younger man named Paul, whom I had actually mentored through his first management role years earlier, said things about my service and my legacy that were generous and true, and that meant more to me than I showed, because I was never a man who wore his feelings on the outside in professional settings. People shook my hand and hugged me and said all the things people say at those events. You deserve this. Enjoy every minute. Don't be a stranger. And I smiled and nodded and felt the particular bittersweet fullness of an ending that is also supposed to be a beginning. I drove home that evening with a box of my office things on the passenger seat, a framed photo of Patricia and the kids from years ago, a small recognition plaque from the State Public Works Association, a coffee mug I'd had for 15 years with a chip on the handle that I had never gotten around to replacing. The drive home felt different from every other drive home I had made, lighter in some ways, heavier in others, and I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a moment before going inside, looking at the house we had lived in for 26 years, and I thought, this is where it all happens now. Everything that comes next happens here. And I felt ready. I felt genuinely, completely ready. That is the part that still surprises me when I look back on it, how ready I felt and how wrong I was about what ready actually meant. The first 2 weeks were genuinely good, and I want to say that plainly because I think it matters to be accurate about the timeline, to not collapse the whole experience into one uniform feeling, when the truth is that it came in stages, and the early stage was not bad at all. I slept until 6:30 on the first Monday of my retirement, which for a man whose body had been dragging itself upright at 5 o'clock for nearly 4 decades felt like a small revolution, and I lay there in the gray morning white, listening to the neighborhood come alive outside the window, and feeling something that I can only describe as physical relief. Like a weight I had been carrying so long I had forgotten it was there had been quietly set down while I slept. Patricia made breakfast that morning. Real breakfast. Eggs and toast and orange juice. Not the grab handful of whatever was quickest that had been my weekday morning routine for most of my adult life. And we sat at the kitchen table together and ate slowly and talked without either of us watching the clock. And it felt like something we had been promising ourselves for years, and had finally gotten around to collecting something we had been promising ourselves for years, and had finally gotten around to collecting. I spent the first week doing the things on the list, the real list, the one I had been building in my head for years. I went out to the garage and pulled the tarp off the Mustang and stood there looking at it the way you look at something you have a complicated history with affection and guilt in roughly equal measure. I made a trip to the auto parts store and spent a good hour and a half talking to a young guy there named Josh, who knew his stuff and who treated me like someone worth talking to, and I came home with a plan and some supplies and the particular energized feeling of a project getting started. I called Kevin and had a real conversation, not the quick 10-minute Sunday call we had defaulted to for years, but a long, unhurried one where we talked about his kids and his work and some things we hadn't talked about in a while. And it felt good. Felt like something being repaired slowly and carefully. Patricia and I went out to dinner twice that first week and to a movie on Saturday, and the weekend felt like an actual weekend rather than the brief gasping recovery period between work weeks. That weekends had felt like for most of my career. I told myself, this is it. This is exactly what I thought it would be, and I meant it. But the third week was different, and the difference was quiet enough that I almost missed it, which is exactly what made it stick. It started with a Monday morning that had nothing in it. Not nothing bad, just nothing, no structure, no reason to be anywhere at a particular time. No calls expected, no meetings on the calendar, no decisions waiting for me. I had finished the initial assessment of the Mustang project and ordered the parts I needed, and they weren't going to arrive for several days, so that was paused. I had done the grocery shopping on Saturday. The yard was mowed. The house was in order. And I stood in the kitchen at 6:45 in the morning with my coffee, and I looked at the day ahead, and I felt, for the first time, but not the last, the particular unease of a man with nowhere to be and nothing that needs him. I turned on the morning news, which I'd never had time to watch when I was working, and I watched it through to the end, and then watched it cycle through again because I hadn't moved. And somewhere in the second cycle, I realized I wasn't actually absorbing any of it. I was just using the sound and the motion of it to fill the room. I started to notice the house differently during those early weeks. The way the silence in it had a texture. The way certain rooms felt emptier at certain times of day. The way the clock on the living room wall that we had owned for 20 years suddenly seemed to tick with a volume I had never registered before. I would walk from the kitchen to the living room to the back hallway and back again, and the house would be exactly the same each time I came through it. Nothing needing attention, nothing out of place, everything already handled. When I was working, the house had been a place I passed through, a place I slept in and ate in and spent the good parts of weekends in. But it had never been a place I inhabited fully for the whole of a weekday, and now I was inhabiting it fully and finding that it was quieter than I had known it was. Patricia was home too. She had retired from her position as an office manager at a pediatric clinic 2 years before me, and she had already built a daily life that worked well for her. A morning walk with her friend Donna from down the street. Her garden, which she tended with a seriousness I had always admired. Her book club on the second Thursday of every month. Her volunteer work at the church thrift store on Wednesday mornings. She was busy in the way that people are busy when they have figured out what their days are for, and I was happy for her. Genuinely. But I also noticed that her rhythm didn't have a natural place in it for me. Not because she didn't want me there, but because she had built it without me over the 2 years I had still been working. And now I was home all day moving around the edges of a life that had organized itself in my absence. The phone calls from work stopped faster than I expected. I had worked for the city for 38 years, and I had assumed, in the vague way you assume things you haven't examined carefully, that there would be a transition period, weeks at least, maybe a couple of months, where my successor and my former colleagues would still be reaching out, asking questions, drawing on the institutional knowledge I had accumulated over nearly 4 decades. My replacement was a competent man named Stewart, who had been my deputy for the last 4 years, and who knew the department well, and who had, I understood intellectually, absolutely no reason to call me. But understanding it intellectually and feeling it emotionally were 2 different things, and the silence of a phone that used to ring constantly was a particular kind of silence that I was not prepared for, and that sat in the house alongside all the other silences of those early weeks, accumulating quietly into something I did not yet have a name for. The moment I keep coming back to, the one that I think of as the real turning point in my understanding of what retirement was actually doing to me, happened on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon about 3.5 months in, and it didn't happen at home, and it didn't happen in a moment of solitude, which is what makes it stay with me the way it does. Because I think I had been half expecting some quiet private reckoning, some early morning moment at the kitchen window where everything would become clear to me, like light coming through a cloud. Instead, it happened at a lunch I had looked forward to, a lunch with 3 men I had worked alongside for a combined total of something like 60 years. We met at a diner about 4 miles from the municipal building, a place called Harmon's that we had been going to for years, a booth in the back that we had sat in so many times the waitress who had worked there forever, a woman named Gloria, used to have our orders started before we got our coats off. I had driven over feeling genuinely good about the afternoon. Feeling something almost like the old feeling, like I was going somewhere that had a shape to it and people in it who knew me in a specific and substantial way. Robert was there, my old colleague from engineering, and Dale from the city planning office, and my closest friend from those years, a man named Howard who had been in public works almost as long as I had, and who had retired 8 months before me, and who I had talked to on the phone a few times, but hadn't seen in person since a brief visit shortly after his own retirement. We ordered our food, and the conversation started the way it always had, easy and familiar. The shorthand of men who had worked through a lot of the same problems over a lot of the same years, and for the first 20 minutes it felt exactly like the lunches we had always had. The same rhythm, the same low, comfortable laughter, the same way of talking about the city and its perpetual infrastructure headaches that we had developed over decades of shared frustration and shared pride. And then something shifted. And it shifted so naturally that I didn't even notice it happening until I was already on the outside of it. Robert started talking about a major drainage project that was currently underway on the east side of the city. A project I knew the history of because I'd laid the groundwork for it in my last year, had fought for the funding and navigated the engineering approvals and handed it off to Stewart with detailed notes and a clear timeline. Robert had been consulting on it in a limited capacity, which I hadn't known, and he started talking about the complications that had come up, a soil condition issue that was affecting the installation schedule, a contractor dispute that was creating delays, and Dale jumped in because he was still working and his office was involved in the permitting side, and Howard had apparently had a conversation with someone still in the department and had some information about how Stewart was handling the contractor situation, and the three of them were off deep into a conversation at my that I had my head bad at been. Not because I didn't understand the project, I understood it better than anyone at that table, but because my understanding was already 3.5 months out of date, already historical rather than current, already the kind of knowledge that belongs to the past rather than the present, and in a conversation about what is happening right now, past knowledge sits quiet and offers nothing. I picked up my coffee cup, and I held it, and I listened, and I watched the three of them talk, watched the animation in their faces, the particular aliveness that comes from being inside something that is still going on, still moving, still mattering, and I felt something that I am going to try to describe as accurately as I can. Because I think accuracy matters more than comfort when you are telling a true story. I felt the specific loneliness of a man sitting at a table full of people who know him and feeling unknown. Not disrespected, not dismissed, just outside the circle of relevance in a way that nobody at the table had done anything to cause, and that nobody at the table probably even noticed. The conversation moved on to other things eventually, and I participated, and the lunch was fine, genuinely fine. Nobody went home feeling bad about the afternoon, but I drove home afterward on roads I had managed the maintenance of for 3 decades, and I sat with what had happened in that booth, and I let myself look at it honestly for the first time. I was no longer inside the thing. Whatever the thing was, the current, the flow, the ongoing life of the work and the city and the department and the projects and the sprusions, I was no longer inside it. I had stepped out of the current, and the current had closed over the place where I had been and kept moving. The way a river closes over a stone you pull out of it, smooth and immediate and completely indifferent. And the question that came to me on that drive home, the one that settled into me and stayed, was not about the job or the project or even my former colleagues. It was about me. If I was no longer the man inside the current, if I was no longer the deputy director, no longer the one who knew where the pipes ran and which contractors could be trusted, and how to move a budget amendment through a city council that didn't want to approve it, if all of that was gone, then what was I the man of? What was I the person who handled? Because my whole sense of myself, and I mean this in the most fundamental way, had been constructed around being useful in a specific and consequential way to a specific and consequential thing. I had been a man defined by his function for so long that I had never developed a clear sense of myself that existed independently of that function. I had been the deputy director, the way a nail is a nail. Not metaphorically, but structurally. The shape of me was the shape of the role, and now the role was gone, and I was trying to figure out what shape I actually was underneath it, and finding, with a quiet that was more frightening than any noise I had ever encountered, that I was not entirely sure. I pulled into the driveway and sat in the car for a few minutes before going inside, the way I sometimes did when I needed a moment between the outside world and the inside of the house, and I looked at my hands on the steering wheel, hands that had signed off on hundreds of millions of dollars of public infrastructure over the course of a career, hands that were now holding a steering wheel in a driveway at 2:30 in the afternoon, with nowhere they needed to be next, and I thought, who are you now? I didn't have an answer. I just went inside and told Patricia the lunch was good and helped her with dinner and didn't say another word about any of it for a long time. I want to try to describe what the days actually felt like during the months that followed that lunch at Harmon's. Not in broad strokes, but in the specific texture of the hours. Because I think the broad strokes of retirement struggle are easy enough to summarize, and what gets lost in the summarizing is the weight of the ordinary, the way the difficulty of that period lived, not in dramatic moments, but in the slow accumulation of unremarkable days that felt, each one of them, like a version of the same question I didn't know how to answer. I was waking up at 5:30 most mornings, my body refusing the gift of sleeping in that I had imagined retirement would bring, pulling me out of sleep at roughly the same hour it always had with the same insistence, as though some internal mechanism that had been wound tight for 4 decades hadn't gotten the message that it could finally rest. I would lie there in the dark for a few minutes, in that brief suspended space before full consciousness organized itself. And for those few seconds I would feel normal, feel like myself, feel like a man with a day that had shape and direction and people waiting on him. And then the room would assemble itself around me, the familiar ceiling, the street light coming faintly through the curtains, Patricia still sleeping quietly beside me, and the day would present itself as what it actually was, open and undemanding, and mine to fill however I could manage, and the familiar hollow feeling would settle in like weather. I had a routine of sorts by that point. I had constructed one deliberately because I understood enough about myself to know that I needed structure or I would drift, but the routine felt thin in a way that the old structure never had, like a sketch of a day rather than a real one. Coffee first, always standing at the kitchen counter in the early quiet while Patricia slept, looking out the window at the backyard where the light was just starting to separate from the darkness. Then the newspaper, which I read more thoroughly than I ever had when I was working, going through it section by section with the methodical attention of a man who has time he needs to account for. Then, if the weather allowed, a walk around the neighborhood, 40 minutes or so. The same streets I had driven through for 26 years, but was now seeing from the ground level, at a pace that let me notice things I had always been moving too fast to register. I noticed which houses had let their gutters go, which driveways needed resurfacing, which stretch of sidewalk had heaved up from tree roots in a way that was going to be a liability issue for the city eventually, and I would catch myself making these assessments automatically, the trained eye of a public works man that apparently did not turn off just because the career had ended, and I would feel something wry and sad about that, about the persistence of a professional habit in a body that no longer had a professional context for it. The Mustang project, which I had hoped would be the anchor of my retirement days, turned out to be less sustaining than I had imagined. Not because the work wasn't real, or because I wasn't genuinely interested in it, but because it was solitary in a way that the work I had always done was not. Public works is collaborative by nature. It involves other people constantly, engineers and contractors and city council members and department heads and crew supervisors, and even the frustrating parts of it. The disputes and the budget fights and the personnel issues were frustrating in a way that confirmed you were in the middle of something that mattered, something with stakes. Working alone in my garage on a 40-year-old engine was satisfying in its own quiet way. But it did not give me other people, and it did not give me stakes, and I was understanding slowly that those two things, people and stakes, were what I had been living on for 38 years without knowing it. I started going to the hardware store more than I needed to, and I want to be honest about why. It wasn't primarily because I needed things. It was because the hardware store was a place where I could talk to people who had some expertise, and where a conversation about pipe fittings or deck stain or electrical conduit felt, briefly, like the kind of purposeful exchange I used to have all day long. I spent 40 minutes in the plumbing aisle talking to a guy named Pete who worked there and who clearly knew his stuff. And I'd drive home with something small I had technically needed, but mostly with a slightly fuller feeling of having had a real conversation with someone who engaged with me as a competent person rather than a retired one. Because that distinction between being seen as competent and being seen as retired was starting to matter to me in ways I hadn't anticipated. There is a way that people, even kind people, even people who mean nothing by it, adjust their engagement with you once they know you are retired. A subtle softening of expectation, a slight reduction in the assumption of relevance, as though retirement is a condition that affects not just your schedule, but your capacity, your currency, your right to be taken seriously in a conversation about how things work. I felt it with Kevin, who listened to my opinions about his work and his house projects with a patience that was just slightly too patient. The patience you extend to someone whose input you have already decided is optional. I felt it with some of Patricia's friends' husbands, men still working who talked about their professional lives with an energy and an assumption of shared interest that quietly excluded me because I no longer had a professional life to bring to the exchange. I felt it in small ways everywhere, and each small way was individually nothing, easily dismissed, probably imagined. But collectively, they were building into a picture of myself that I found genuinely difficult to sit with. A picture of a man who had moved, without wanting to and without quite noticing, from the center of things to the periphery. The nights were their own particular difficulty. I had always been a solid sleeper, one of those men who falls asleep quickly and stays that way, and the insomnia that started creeping in around month 4 of retirement was new and disorienting. I would wake at 2 or 2:30, and my mind would be running, not anxiously exactly, not the racing, panicked kind of wakefulness, but a steady, purposeless activation, like a machine that had been switched on with nothing to process. I would lie there in the dark and think about things from a long time ago. The early years of my career when everything was still being figured out. The kids when they were small, the house when it was new to us, and every room was still becoming what it would eventually be. I would think about my father, who had worked in a steel mill for 32 years and retired at 62 and was dead at 67. And I would think about whether I looked like him now the way I had started to think I might, in the face, around the eyes, in the particular way my shoulders had started to round forward slightly, in a way I was trying to correct and couldn't quite manage. I was aware of my body in retirement in a way I had not been while working, aware of its slowness in the morning, its stiffness after sitting too long, the way my right knee announced itself going downstairs in a language that was new and that I did not enjoy learning. When you are working and busy and engaged, your body is mostly just the vehicle, the thing that carries you from one task to the next, and you don't spend a great deal of time noticing its condition the way you notice a machine you are depending on. When you are idle, the body becomes more present, more insistent, more willing to tell you things about time and where that you would frankly rather not know, and I was learning to receive that information with something approximating equanimity, while mostly just feeling old in a way I had not felt before retirement, and that retirement seemed to have accelerated rather than relieved. There is something that happens in the quiet of retirement that I don't think you can fully prepare for, and that I don't think anyone who hasn't lived through it can quite explain to you, which is the way the past becomes present in a new and persistent way when the forward motion of a working life is no longer carrying you away from it. When you are working, when your days are full and your mind is occupied and there is always something that needs handling right now, the past stays where you put it, back there somewhere, accessible if you go looking for it, but not insisting on your attention if you don't. In retirement, the past stops waiting politely. It comes forward on its own, and it sits down across from you at the kitchen table in the morning, and it stays there. And you can turn on the television, or go out to the garage, or take a walk around the neighborhood. But when you come back, it is still there, patient and unhurried, because it has nowhere else to be, and neither do you. The thing that comes back most often for me, the one with the most weight to it, is the years when Kevin was growing up and I was at the height of my career, and the two things, the career and the growing up, were happening simultaneously, and I was not fully present for both of them. Kevin was born when I was 31, which meant that his childhood and adolescence coincided almost exactly with the years when I was building toward the deputy director position, the years when the career was making its most significant demands on my time and attention and energy. I was home most evenings. I want to be fair to myself about that. I was not an absent father in the physical sense. I was there for dinner and for weekends and for the important occasions, but I was present the way a man is present when part of him is still somewhere else, still in the building on the other side of town, still running the next day's problems through the part of his brain that never really clocked out. Kevin was a quiet kid, thoughtful, the kind of child who didn't demand attention loudly, but who you could tell, if you were paying close enough attention, needed it in a steady and consistent way. I was not always paying close enough attention. There was a period when Kevin was about 13, 14, going through the particular difficulty of early adolescence in a way that was mostly interior and therefore mostly invisible if you weren't watching carefully, and I think now, with the clarity that distance and stillness provide, that he needed more from me during those years than I gave him. Not more in terms of things or activities or structured time together, but more in terms of presence, real presence, the kind where you are actually listening rather than performing listening while your mind works on something else. I didn't see it clearly then. I told myself he was fine. He was a good kid. He was doing well in school. There was nothing obviously wrong. And I used the absence of crisis as permission to not look more carefully. I understand now that the absence of crisis is not the same as the presence of enough, and that a quiet child who doesn't make demands is not necessarily a child who doesn't have them. Kevin and I are close now, closer than we were for a long time, and I am grateful for that closeness in a way that is complicated by knowing it was built later than it should have been, built in his adulthood rather than his childhood, built from a starting point of two grown men who had to find each other across a distance that I had allowed to develop. That Sunday afternoon in his kitchen, the one I told you about at the beginning where I stood, invisible for 12 minutes with my warm, sweet tea, I think part of what made it land so hard was not just the invisibility itself, but the awareness that the distance that made the invisibility possible was something I had contributed to, not maliciously, not intentionally, but through years of being physically present and emotionally elsewhere. And you cannot entirely undo that kind of distance no matter how many good Sunday phone calls you make in your 60s. Patricia is the other place where the regrets live, and they live there differently than they do with Kevin, with a longer history and a more complicated texture. We have been married for 41 years, and I love her in the deep, undemonstrative way that long marriages produce. A love that is less about feeling and more about knowing, about the accumulated weight of shared decades, shared decisions, shared losses, shared ordinary days that add up to a life that neither of you could have built alone. But I also think about the version of our marriage that might have existed if I had held the job more loosely, if I had been more willing to let the work stop at the door of the house rather than carrying it inside with me every evening and setting it down at the dinner table where it took up space that belonged to other things. Patricia managed our home and our social life and our family obligations and the thousand invisible threads that hold a household together, and she did it competently and without complaint because that was who she was. But I think about how much of that she carried alone while I was there in the house, but not really available, and I think about whether she felt, during those years, the way Kevin felt, the way a person feels, when the one they need to be present is physically there but functionally somewhere else. I never asked her directly. That is its own regret. The conversations we didn't have during the years when we were both inside the busyness of it, and the busyness made those conversations feel less urgent than they were. We have them now. Those conversations, retirement has given us the time and the stillness for them, and they have changed things between us in ways I am grateful for. But I am also aware that there are years of accumulated unasked questions and unspoken things between us that we are only now, in our 60s, beginning to work through. And I wish we had started earlier. Wish I had created the conditions for that kind of conversation earlier, when the kids were still home and the house was full and there was still so much life ahead of us that we might have shaped differently if we had talked about it more. I don't say any of this to punish myself. I have tried, genuinely tried, not to turn the regrets into a form of self-flagellation that doesn't serve anyone, because I also know that I did the best I understood how to do at the time with what I had and what I knew, and that is true and it matters. But it is also true that the best I understood how to do left some things undone that I now wish had been done. And sitting with that, honestly, without flinching away from it, feels like the least I can offer the people who lived alongside me through those years. About 5 months into retirement, I made a decision that I told myself was practical and that I now understand was at least partly an act of quiet desperation, which was to get serious about finding something to do with my days that felt like it mattered in the way that work had mattered. That carried some of the same weight and demanded some of the same competence and returned some of the same feeling of being a person whose presence made a difference to something beyond himself. I approached it the way I had always approached problems, methodically, with a list and a plan, because that is the only way I know how to approach things, and because the alternative, which was to sit with the emptiness and let it be what it was, felt at that point in my life like something I was not yet capable of doing. The most obvious avenue was consulting, and I explored it seriously for a few weeks, reaching out to a couple of firms that worked with municipal governments on infrastructure planning, sending emails to former colleagues who had gone that route after their own retirements, putting together a rough outline of what I could offer based on 38 years of public works experience. The response was polite and not entirely discouraging, but it was also not what I had hoped for, which was an immediate recognition of my value and a clear path back into work that felt consequential. One firm told me they would keep my information on file, which is the professional equivalent of a soft no. A former colleague said the consulting market for municipal infrastructure was tighter than it had been, and that most of the contracts were going to younger people with more current software credentials, which was true, and which I had known on some level, but which still landed with a particular flatness when someone said it out loud to me directly. I let the consulting idea go after about 3 weeks. Not because it was impossible, but because the pursuit of it was making me feel worse rather than better, was making me feel like a man trying to walk back through a door that had already closed, and there is a particular indignity in that feeling that I decided I didn't want to keep inflicting on myself. I turned to volunteering next, the way most retired people eventually do, because it is the answer that everyone suggests and because the logic of it is sound enough. You have skills and time, and the world has needs, and the connection of those two things should produce something that feels meaningful. I signed up through the county's volunteer coordination office, and after a few conversations with a patient woman there, named Beverly, who was clearly practiced at matching retired professionals with appropriate opportunities, I ended up connected with two organizations, a nonprofit that provided technical assistance to small municipalities in the region that couldn't afford full-time infrastructure expertise, and a mentorship program at the community college that paired experienced professionals with students in public administration and urban planning programs. The nonprofit work was the closer match to what I had actually done for a living, and it started, well, I went to my first meeting feeling something that was recognizably close to the old purposeful energy. Sitting around a table with a small team looking at the infrastructure challenges of a rural township about 40 miles away that was dealing with an aging water system and a budget that couldn't support a proper engineering assessment. I knew this territory, knew it in my bones, and I could feel myself becoming useful in a specific and grounded way during that first meeting. Asking the right questions, identifying the leverage points, helping the team see the problem from an operational angle that they hadn't fully considered. I drove home that evening feeling better than I had felt in months, feeling something close to myself. And I told Patricia about the meeting with more animation than I had shown about anything in a while, and she listened and seemed genuinely glad to see me engaged, and that gladness felt good too. Felt like confirmation that I was on the right track. But the nonprofit work was intermittent, meeting every 2 or 3 weeks, with stretches of time between meetings that were mine to fill. And the mentorship program, while genuinely rewarding in its way, gave me a few hours a week of substantive engagement with young people who were just starting to figure out what public service meant, which was meaningful, but which also underscored, in ways I found quietly difficult, the distance between where I was in my life and where they were in theirs. I was the past tense of what they were going to become, and while I could offer them something real from that position, the position itself was a reminder of the direction time moved in, which was not toward me. I tried other things in that searching period, with the restless energy of a man who keeps moving because stopping feels like admitting something he is not ready to admit. I joined a civic organization, a local chapter of a group that worked on community improvement projects, and I went to 3 meetings and found the meetings competent but uninspiring. Organized around a kind of consensus-building process that moved at a pace I found genuinely frustrating after years of making decisions in environments where things needed to happen quickly because the alternative was a road that didn't get repaired or a water main that didn't get replaced. I signed up for a photography class at the community center, something Patricia had suggested and that I had resisted for a while before agreeing to try. And I went 4 times and learned some things and took some pictures that were not bad for a beginner, and felt, the whole time, like a man doing an activity rather than a man doing something that mattered. And I think that distinction between activity and meaning, between filling time and contributing to something that mattered, and I think that distinction between activity and meaning, between filling time and contributed turned. What I was looking for, and I could not have articulated this clearly at the time, but I understand it better now, was not a hobby or a volunteer position or a social organization or a class. What I was looking for was the feeling of being load-bearing, of being a person whose presence and effort held something up that would otherwise be less stable, and that feeling is not something you can manufacture or substitute or approximate with an activity you chose from a list because it seemed like a reasonable thing for a retired man to do with his afternoons. It either comes from something real or it doesn't come at all. And I was beginning, slowly and with considerable resistance, to understand that the particular form of it I had known for 38 years was not available to me anymore, and that whatever came next was going to have to be built from something different. something I hadn't found yet and wasn't entirely sure existed. And sitting with that uncertainty was the hardest work I had done in a very long time. I cannot point to a single morning or a single conversation or a single moment where the shift happened, and I have thought about this enough to be confident that the shift did not happen that way, did not arrive cleanly the way a decision arrives or a realization arrives, but came instead the way weather changes in the Midwest in early spring, gradually and unevenly, warm one day and cold the next, the ground thawing and refreezing several times before it finally stays soft. The change so incremental that you cannot say on any given A that K will terrify it with his. That is the most accurate way I know to describe what happened to me somewhere in the second year of retirement. This gradual and uneven thawing of something that had been frozen in a posture of resistance and loss, this slow and reluctant arrival at something I would not quite call peace, but that was in the same neighborhood as peace, close enough that I could see it from where I was standing. The first thing that changed, I think, was that I stopped fighting the mornings. I had spent the better part of the first year of retirement experiencing the open, unscheduled morning as an accusation, as evidence of my own irrelevance, as a space that needed to be filled or justified or explained, and at some point, without any deliberate decision on my part, I stopped experiencing it that way, and started experiencing it that way, and started experiencing it as simply what it was, which was time, quiet time, mine to be in without owing an account of how I spent it. I would get up at 5:30 and make my coffee and stand at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard in the early light, and instead of feeling the familiar hollow anxiety of a day with nothing required of me, I would sometimes just feel the morning, the particular stillness of it. The way the light came up slowly over the fence line and touched the top of the oak tree first, before working its way down to the yard. The way Patricia's garden looked in the early morning before the day heated up and the colors deepened. Small things. Things that had been there every morning of my retirement and that I had been too busy being unhappy to notice properly. I started paying attention differently, and I think that shift in attention was the beginning of everything else that followed. I began to understand something about identity that I suspect most men of my generation never have to confront directly, because the work keeps going until the body gives out, which is that the self you build around a function is real and legitimate and worth respecting, but it is not the only self you have, and retirement, for all its difficulties, is the first sustained opportunity many of us get to find out what else is there underneath the function. I was not the deputy director of public works anymore, and I was not going to be again. And the version of me that had been defined by that role was genuinely gone in the way that things that belong to a particular period of life are gone when that period ends, and grieving that was not weakness, it was appropriate, it was honest, it was the right response to a real loss. But underneath that loss, I was beginning to find there was still a person, not a role, not a function, not a man defined by his usefulness to a particular institution, but a person. A 68-year-old man who had lived a long and specific life and who had, it turned out, things to notice and things to care about, and things to notice and things to care about, and things to be present for that had nothing to do with storm drains or budget amendments or contractor disputes. Patricia and I started talking more, really talking, in the way that the first year of retirement had occasionally allowed and that the second year was making more consistently possible. And those conversations were doing something to me that I had not expected, which was reminding me that I was known by someone in a way that was deeper and more durable than any professional relationship I had ever had. That 41 years of shared life had produced a kind of mutual knowledge between us that was, when I stopped moving fast enough to actually feel it, genuinely sustaining when the addy seldomly. I started spending more real time with my grandkids when they visited, not performing grandfather the way I sometimes felt I had been performing it, showing up and being present in the technical sense, but actually getting down on the floor with them and letting their world be interesting to me, and finding, somewhat to my surprise, that it was. That a 6-year-old's complete absorption in a particular toy or a 9-year-old's passionate explanation of something they had learned at school was actually worth paying full attention to if you let it be. The consulting work with the nonprofit continued and settled into something that felt right at the scale it was, not a substitute for the career, but a genuine contribution at a pace and a volume that matched where I actually was in my life rather than where I used to be. I stopped needing it to be more than it was. Stopped measuring it against the 38 years and finding it insufficient, and started receiving it for what it actually was. which was useful work done by a man who still had something real to offer, offered at a pace that did not consume him. That recalibration from measuring my current life against the life I used to have and finding it wanting, to receiving my current life as its own thing with its own value, was the central work of that second year, and I will not pretend it was easy or complete, or that I do not still sometimes slip back into the old measurement, because I do, some mornings more than others. But the direction of travel had changed, and the mornings were softer than they had been, and the refrigerator hum had become just the sound the house made when it was at rest. And that was enough for now. I want to speak to you directly for a few minutes. Not from a place of having solved anything or arrived anywhere, particularly tidy, but from the place I am actually in, which is the honest and imperfect middle of figuring this out. Still working on it, still having mornings that are harder than others, still catching myself measuring my current life against the one I used to have and having to consciously redirect that measurement towards something more fair and more useful. I am talking to you because I think there are things worth saying about this season of life that don't get said enough, or that get said in the wrong register. Too cheerful, or too clinical, or too full of the kind of packaged optimism that sounds good in an airport bookstore and lands hollow at 6 in the morning when you are standing in your kitchen wondering what the day is for. So let me just say what I actually think as plainly as I can, and you can take what is useful and set aside what isn't. The first thing I want to say is about the shame, because I think the shame is the part that does the most damage and the part that gets talked about least. If you are retired or approaching retirement and you are feeling lost or empty or irrelevant or invisible in ways you didn't expect and didn't prepare for, the shame of feeling those things on top of the feelings themselves is a significant additional burden, because we have been taught, men of our generation especially, that retirement is a reward, that we have earned it, that gratitude is the appropriate response, and that struggling with it means something is wrong with us rather than something is hard about it. I want to tell you clearly that struggling with retirement does not mean something is wrong with you. It means you built a life around something that gave you meaning and structure and identity and community and a daily reason to be competent and needed. And now the shape of that life has fundamentally changed, and that is genuinely hard, and you are allowed to find it hard without apologizing for finding it hard. The second thing I want to say is about identity, because I think identity is the hidden center of almost everything difficult about this transition, and it is almost never discussed in those terms. We talk about staying busy and finding hobbies and keeping active and maintaining social connections, all of which matter and none of which are wrong. But underneath all of those practical conversations is a more fundamental question that the practical conversations tend to skip over, which is, who are you when you are not the thing you spend your adult life being? That question does not have a quick answer, and it does not respond well to being rushed. And I think one of the most important things you can do in the early period of retirement is to resist the pressure, internal and external, to answer it immediately by replacing the old identity with a new activity. Give yourself the time and the honesty to actually sit with the question, because the answer that comes from sitting with it is going to be more real and more durable than the answer that comes from filling the space as quickly as possible with something that keeps you from having to feel the question at all. The third thing is about the people closest to you, and I say this as a man who learned it later than he should have. Your spouse, if you have one, has a life that has been running without your full presence in it for decades. And retirement changes the geometry of your shared life in ways that require honest conversation and real adjustment from both of you. Do not assume the adjustment will happen naturally, or that your presence in the house all day, every day, is as welcome and uncomplicated as you might like to believe. Talk about it. Ask what she needs, what works, what doesn't, what the new shape of your days together should look like, because that conversation, had honestly and early, will save you both a significant amount of quiet friction. And the last thing, the one I come back to most, is simply this. The years ahead of you are not a lesser version of the years behind you. They are not a consolation prize or a waiting room or a slow fade. They are actual years, actual mornings and afternoons and evenings, actual chances to be present with the people you love and to notice the things that have always been worth noticing, and to do work, whatever form that work takes, that connects you to something beyond yourself. They deserve to be lived with the same seriousness and the same willingness to show up fully that you brought to everything else. It is a Tuesday morning as I sit with all of this, which is a detail that means something to me, even if it sounds arbitrary, because Tuesday mornings used to be the mornings I dreaded least when I was working. The week already one day in, the rhythm established, the Monday problems either handled or handed off, and Tuesday had a kind of settled competence to it that I always appreciated. Now Tuesday is just a morning, just light coming through the kitchen window at an angle that belongs specifically to this time of year, late autumn pressing toward winter, the light lower and more golden and less direct than it was 2 months ago, touching the counter and the coffee maker and the edge of the table in a way that is quietly worth looking at if you were in the habit of looking. Patricia is across from me with her own coffee and the book she is currently reading, and she is not talking, and neither am I, and the silence between us is the comfortable kind. The kind that 41 years of marriage produces when both people have finally stopped needing to fill every quiet moment with something, when the quiet itself has become a form of companionship rather than an absence of it. The neighborhood outside is doing what it does on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. The school bus came through about 20 minutes ago, and now the street is quiet, a few cars passing occasionally, somebody's leaf blower starting up 2 or 3 houses down and then stopping, the particular suburban stillness of a weekday morning when the working world has gone off to work and the houses belong to the people who are home. I am 69 years old, and I have been retired for a little over 3 years, and I want to tell you, honestly and without the false brightness of a man performing contentment he doesn't feel, that I am doing better than I was, that the mornings are softer than they were in that first year, that I have found a way of being in my days that feels, most of the time, like a life rather than a waiting room. The consulting work with the nonprofit continues, and I have found a genuine rhythm with it, going in every couple of weeks and contributing what I actually know to problems that actually matter, and coming home feeling the quiet satisfaction of useful work done at a pace that suits where I am, rather than where I was. The mentorship at the community college has become something I look forward to in a way I did not anticipate, sitting across from young people who are just beginning to understand what public service means, and finding that I have more to offer them than I initially thought, not just technical knowledge but the harder-won things, patience, perspective, the ability to see a problem from multiple angles, because you have seen enough problems to know they always look different depending on where you are standing. The Mustang is coming along. Slowly, because I am not in a hurry anymore, because I have learned, or am learning, that the point of the Mustang is not the finished car. The point is the Tuesday afternoon in the garage with the radio on, and the work in front of me, and the particular satisfaction of a man doing something with his hands that he understands. I think about my father sometimes, the man who worked in the steel mill for 32 years and retired at 62 and was dead at 67, and I think about what he might have felt in those 5 years if he had had the words for it or the permission to say them, and I feel something for him that is part grief and part kinship and part a quiet resolve to do this differently than he did, to stay in it, to keep looking, to not mistake the silence for the end of something when it might also be the beginning of something quieter and more. That Sunday afternoon in Kevin's kitchen, standing invisible with my warm, sweet tea, I did not know yet that invisibility was not only a loss, that there was something on the other side of being constantly needed and constantly visible that was worth finding, something that required the noise to stop before you could hear it. I am still finding it. I think that is probably how it works, not a destination you arrive at, but a direction you keep moving in, imperfectly in some mornings more willingly than others, but moving. If you have stayed with me through all of this, through the Tuesday mornings and the warm, sweet tea and the diner booth at Harmon's and the 2 o'clock ceilings in the garage and the Mustang under its tarp and everything in between, then I think you already understand why you stayed. And I think the reason has something to do with recognition, with the particular feeling of hearing something said out loud that you have been carrying quietly inside yourself without quite having the language for it. Maybe you are already in retirement, and you recognize the mornings I describe, the hollow ones and the slowly softening ones both. Maybe you are still working, and you felt somewhere underneath the familiarity of the schedule and the alarm and the drive-in, a faint awareness of this season approaching, a quiet question about who you will be when the structure that has held you for decades is no longer there to hold you. Maybe you are somewhere in between, in that particular corridor of the mid to late 50s or early 60s, where retirement is close enough to think about seriously but far enough away that it still feels like something that happens to other people. Wherever you are, I want you to know that what you feel about all of this, Whatever complicated and not entirely comfortable thing you feel is real and it is yours and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than managed away with a hobby or a busy schedule or the performance of gratitude that the world sometimes seems to expect from people who have, by every practical measure, done all right. I'm not a counselor or a philosopher or a man with the system. I am just a man who lived something and took the time to say it honestly because I believe that honest telling matters, that it reaches something in people that the polished version never quite touches. So let me leave you with the question I've been sitting with myself, the one that feels most worth carrying into whatever comes next. When the work is done and the role is over and the house gets quiet, who are you in that quiet? Not who you were, not who you are planning to become, but who you actually are right now, in the still of an ordinary morning with your coffee going warm in your hands. I think that question is worth more of your time than most of us have given it. And if this story reached something in you, if it names something you have been carrying, I hope you will consider subscribing to this channel because there are more stories like this one, more honest tellings of what this season of life actually feels like from the inside. And I would very much like you to be there for them.